Welcome to Work Like a Human, a podcast from Go Innovation. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Work Like a Human. My name is Rory Tyer. I'm an executive coach and a co-founder of Go Innovation, and I will be your guide, your host on this journey. I look forward to being joined by many other voices. For this inaugural episode, I've got a very special voice. I interviewed Kelly Lewis, who, along with her co-author Brian Emerson, released recently a book called Navigating Polarities. So to start off, I'd like to do a thought exercise that I actually experienced. Kelly led me and some others in a workshop through this. So take a moment and think about, are you a chocolate person or a vanilla person? Like, which do you prefer when it comes to dessert? Okay, maybe you have a preference, maybe you don't. What about this? Are you a cat person or a dog person? No? Okay, are you a breakfast person or a brunch person? Okay, those are choices it's easy for us to think about in terms of either or thinking. If I decide I'm a vanilla person, there's not some huge thing lost in the world, right? Maybe you think there is if you're a chocolate person. But the choice is like either or thinking serves us well. Okay, but what about this? Are you a justice person or a mercy person? Are you an autonomy person or a collaboration person? Are you a candor person or a diplomacy person? Are you a leadership person or a followership person? Now, those things, you should probably be responding to me by thinking, I don't think I want to choose one of those. Should I really choose between autonomy and collaboration? It seems like they are both helpful in different ways and at different times. Or should I really choose between justice and mercy? Should I really choose between candor, which is extremely helpful, and diplomacy, which is also extremely helpful? When I first experienced Kelly walking me and other people through this, she made the point that this illustrates the place at which either or binary thinking fails us, because we're dealing with something called a polarity. And to really live into and thrive in the midst of a polarity, we need to practice both and thinking. But our brains are not necessarily wired for both and thinking. And sometimes it can feel super confusing. Where do we even begin? So in this interview, Kelly and I explain what polarities are, we talk through why they matter, and then she walks us through something that she and Brian created called a Polarity Navigator. So we actually construct a polarity that we feel is extremely relevant right now, given the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. This actually ended up being a fairly emotionally powerful episode for me. Full disclosure, we weren't even planning to release the podcast at this time because there's so much else going on, but I just felt like this conversation was so timely that I had to go ahead and move our podcast release date up. So without further ado, let's step into that interview. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for being willing to join me for this conversation.
Well, it's great to be here, Rory. I appreciate you having me and look forward to the conversation in front of us.
So I have been thoroughly enjoying your book, Navigating Polarities, using both and I'm looking at the title to make sure I get it right. Using both and thinking to lead transformation. Polarity management has just been such a meaningful framework for me personally, and I've gotten to use it with a lot of individuals and coaching with a lot of groups. Like, walk me through the introduction to polarity navigation. Like, start off with why does it matter? And then let's just go from there.
So basically what a polarity is it's a situation in which two interdependent and seemingly contradictory, that's an important piece, states need to be maintained over time. So an example of one that we're in as human beings day in and day out is activity rest. We need activity and we need rest. And if we kind of focus on one and neglect the other over time, bad things will happen. We know, we've all felt that. And so they're interdependent to one another. One makes the other true. The tricky thing with polarities is even if we know that it's something that's interdependent, which means it needs us to think about it through a both and lens rather than an either or lens, our brains are wired for either or. So our brains really, really like certainty, and they really, really like to know.
It's a survival instinct, right? Basically, it's a self-protection thing. Yeah,
exactly. And so what oftentimes happens is we're in the middle of these things that are called polarities, which are really paradoxical tensions. And we treat them like a problem to solve, where we can just say, well, either it's this or it's that, done. And it gets us into trouble when we oftentimes innocently treat a polarity as a problem to solve, which then leads me into why they're important. What the research has found, and my co-author Brian Emerson did some research on this, which is awesome. What he found was that when people run up against a polarity and they don't have a way to make sense of it, and typically people need some type of visual sense-making tool to be able to make sense of it, just because of the way our brains are wired.
Yeah.
They do what he calls suffer paradox.
Yeah.
And when we begin to suffer, there's kind of a number of different stages that we go through that I'm happy to talk about. But bottom line, what happens is results get worse, relationships get damaged, morale gets worse, and communication gets worse, and we end up suffering. What I have found personally, if I kind of scale it up to, my big why that I do this work, is when we're suffering, it can be hard to be the best version of ourselves.
Yeah.
And if we can allow that suffering to really touch us and kind of find our way through the other side, it increases our capacity for love. And at the end of the day, for me, the reason why polarities matter is because when we learn to navigate them effectively, it increases our capacity for love.
So I want to pull out a couple of things that I heard. So when you introduced the polarity, you said activity, rest. And in the book, I know you write it out as like 2 colons in between the 2 words. And I think one of the things you talk about, you and Brian talk about in the book, is like our language isn't even that adequate for grasping polarities. And so you have to, and we'll get to there in a moment, like you do some really creative things with helping people envision how can we navigate this effectively. But I just think it was interesting. So I hear you say activity, rest, and there's this implied, like, we need to think them both together. And to do that, we have to almost artificially change how we speak it, which I think is really helpful, because our words can end up revealing and creating realities. And then you talked about suffering paradox. And I think another way you frame that in the book that I liked is when a polarity has you.
Yep. And you don't have it.
Yes, and you don't have it. And you guys repeated that so often. And it just felt like it really aptly described a lot of situations I've seen in people's lives and then in group and organizational dynamics. Walk me through, you guys have developed a tool called the Polarity Navigator, which is, I love it. Like, honestly, I think it's so helpful. I realize that there's a lot of different places you could go with this. In the book, again, I recommend if you're listening or watching, it's a great book. But walk me through that navigator just piece by piece.
Yeah. So the Navigator kind of stands squarely on the shoulders of Barry Johnson's work. Both Brian and I learned under and kind of worked with Barry. And one of the things that his polarity map does, if people are listening and are familiar with that, is it does a great job of differentiating the 2 poles. So it allows you to pull apart, activity and rest, for example, and to be able to see the benefits that when we focus on activity, there's lots of good benefits, right? We get energy, we get motivation, we're productive. And when we focus on rest, there's lots of great benefits that come from that. What it also helps us do, it shows the interdependency. So when we are, if we over focus on activity and we neglect rest, it will help us to identify what we call the overuses of activity, right? There's nothing inherently bad about activity.
So not a con.
It is not
pros and cons. This was helpful to me because I'm so used to thinking of it as pros and cons, and I've unfortunately facilitated it that way before. Getting that benefits and overuses frame was extremely helpful.
Yeah, because the thing that's important for people, the distinction is there's nothing inherently bad about activity or rest, right? Yeah. Only bad things happen when there's an interdependent pair, when you over focus on one and neglect the other. So there's benefits and there's overuses. So one thing the Polarity Navigator lets you do is it differentiates, pulls the 2 poles apart, and helps you see what the benefits and the overuses are, which then the beautiful thing about that for individuals and teams and organizations is it can help you start to understand the past, what's happened and why it's happened. And it can also help you predict the future. Right? If we continue to do this, here's what will occur. The second thing the Navigator does is it reintegrates the poles, which Brian and I found in kind of our work with this, that when we don't reintegrate the poles and have a place on, in our case, the navigator to do it, oftentimes people misunderstand the natural way a polarity works, which oftentimes is represented by an infinity loop. They think the way you actually work a polarity is by swinging back and forth.
Like
from
a pendulum.
one pole, like a pendulum.
Like sometimes they're going to be here, sometimes they're going to be here, and that's just sort of the way it is. And you guys would say, no, there's actually a better way.
Yes, which is what we call the third way. We call it the transformational third way, which is around if I could blend together the best of activity, rest, right? If I could blend together the best of being candid and the best of being diplomatic. Right now, given what's going on in the world, if I could blend together the best of individual freedom and collective responsibility, what would that be like? How would I show up in the world, and what would my mindset be if I could operate that way? So that's one place on the navigator. And then the third piece on the navigator is what we call the vulnerability through way. What we've discovered is that oftentimes when you're working with a polarity, you have a preference, just a natural preference for one pole over the other. And oftentimes what can occur is part of our identity can become constructed around that pole. So for instance, in the United States, right, we have a much greater preference for activity than we do rest. And so part of our identity over the past couple years has been, how often do you hear people say, I'm busy? Right? It's part of who we are. So then when we're asked to step into that third way and to blend, kind of loosen up our grip on activity as an example, and blend together rest, it can be scary because we feel like we're losing a part of who we are. And so what we have found is for people to sustainably stand in that third way and truly navigate a polarity, they have to be able to name the vulnerability or risk that they're going to experience, the uncertainty, the discomfort, that they're going to be able to they have to be able to name that in order to help stay standing there. And the other quick tidbit I'd say there is Brene Brown, when she was doing her research on the book Braving the Wilderness, she discovered the correlation between our capacity to hold what she called the tension of the and our capacity for discomfort. That it was our lack of capacity for discomfort that drove us to go back to either or thinking. So we kind of integrated some of her research into the navigator. And then the last piece, the fourth piece on the navigator, is what we call integrated strategies. So it's like, okay, now that we've laid out the territory, what are the actions? What are the safe to fail experiments we're going to do to help us show up and act from this blended place rather than this place of either I'm going to be over here on activity or I'm going to be over here on rest.
Yeah, I appreciate that part of the navigator, especially because I think for some people, this can feel sort of like a too abstract or too touchy-feely thought exercise. And some of that is just we have a lot of very low EQ adults in the world, in workplaces, and that is difficult for them to be candid about fears, as an example. But obviously, at the end of the day, like, we have work that needs to get done. We need to work together. And so I appreciate that it does lend itself, once you get to the end, of saying, well, what can we do? What can we try? And then, but you approach that doing with a different mindset, trying to integrate both sides of that pole. I just really think it's so helpful right now. Like, it's very timely that we're having this conversation, because I think even if people don't realize it, there are a lot of polarities right now in the world, and specifically in the US, that people are trying, and in some cases failing, to navigate well around like our response to this coronavirus pandemic. And so I wonder, as like a thought experiment, can we construct a navigator right now and like walk through it together? Would you be up for that?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let me share with you kind of the ones that have been front and center. There's a lot of them out there. The ones that have been front and center to me, kind of at the macro level and more at the micro level, have been this individual freedom and collective responsibility has been the one I've noticed a lot playing out macro. And then the one that seems to be alive in my day-to-day conversations is knowing and learning, or knowing and not knowing, because the pandemic has thrown so many people from a place of like, I know my routine, I know how I'm going to work today, I know how, my kids are going to learn today, to this it's thrown them to the other side, which is there's a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know, and now I know I don't know.
Yeah.
And that is super uncomfortable. So, those two could be fun to play with. A couple of other ones that I had looked at, like hope and reality is a big one. Take serious, hold lightly, survive and thrive, together, apart. Focus on self, focus on others. So there's a whole bunch of them. Where do you want to go?
This is helpful because I forgot that I was going to ask you, let's list some common ones. You do this in the book, and it's helpful because if you're listening and this sounds abstract, I think when you start actually talking about them, like when you facilitated in a workshop that I was a part of last year, you actually had this activity where we began, you said, okay, who's a chocolate person, and yet people raise like your left hand, and you're like, who's vanilla? And we raise a right hand. And then you did a couple more of those, and then you dropped one on us that was like, who's justice? Who's mercy? And everyone just felt really uncomfortable, like, oh my goodness, you're asking me to choose between, and you were like, that's sort of the point, like either or thinking isn't sufficient when you encounter, and I think you talk about this in the book, like we need to make sure we're dealing with a polarity and not a problem, because there are problems that need to be solved. Either or thinking is still good, but when you run up against something where you're like, I don't think I'm supposed to choose between these two, they need to coexist, you may be dealing with a polarity.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Well So which of those, the first one you mentioned, I think, was individual freedom versus, like, what did you say, collective responsibility?
Yeah.
Well, let's play with that one, because that feels applicable on a lot of levels. It feels applicable to like people working on teams in different ways, organizational life, and obviously it's applicable to the crisis right now. So why don't we play with that one?
All right, great. And something I'd offer, if I can, that I just noticed in your language, Rory, that I think is so important in language, and that oftentimes happens in our language out in the world, is our minds want to frame a polarity as this versus that. And so when you say individual freedom versus collective responsibility, just think about what happens, right? It immediately puts those two things in conflict and
it
in
creates
competition.
An opposition.
It does. And so it's one of the ways you can start to pay attention to what might be a polarity and how I might be in relationship to this polarity is to notice your own language. And when versus comes into play, like your antenna should be up.
Sure.
So just replace verses with and better, even better, it's like replace and with nothing. It just allow the two things to coexist, kind of how we do, like you were saying in the book with the double colon.
Yeah.
Okay. So individual freedom, collective responsibility. Let's talk together about if we were mapping this, right? And we were first starting with the benefits of individual freedom. What are the benefits of individual freedom?
Yeah. So, I mean, my sense of individuality is not erased. It's actually it may actually be celebrated.
Yeah. It's a great example. So, right, there's a celebrated, you celebrate the uniqueness of the self in that case. There's autonomy.
Autonomy,
right?
yeah.
There's choice. There's me being able to take care of me. So you start to get the sense, right? So it's like, okay. And I think the main ones that we operate from the benefit, like the values within the United States that we hold tightly are choice and autonomy. So then let's go to the overuses, because that's typically what happens next. If we were to hold individual freedom so tightly that none of us cared about our collective responsibility right now, for example, to flatten the curve.
Yeah.
What would the overuses of individual freedom be?
My first thought was selfishness.
Okay. It's a great one.
Yeah.
Yep. Selfishness.
Isolation, greed, maybe. Like
isolation.
Yeah.
Yep. Inequality. And so you can start to see how some of those could play out and may already be playing out. People are feeling them. And then what happens is when we start to experience that, it becomes a real issue. So the only solution to that issue is to swing the pendulum, right? Is to swing up to the benefits of collective responsibility and say, well, I need to get some of those. So if we think about the benefits of collective responsibility, you can think about things like fairness, connection,
Solidarity,
care for others, selflessness, putting ourselves second, duty might be an example of one. And so, of course, then we're like, yes, this is the answer. This is what we need. And then if we said, well, let's just stay here because it feels so good. And that individual freedom thing, that was silly. We didn't need that. Why did we even think that was a good idea in the first place? Then we would end up with the overuses of collective responsibility. So if you thought about what those might be, if you were to hold so tightly to collective responsibility and completely neglect individual freedom, what might occur?
I mean, my first thought is totalitarianism, like just to take it to the extreme. I mean, that's where it goes. A bit of coercion in general, maybe. Yep.
It's what you said before. Yep. Coercion, dependence. I feel like I'm taken advantage of. There's a loss of freedom. There's a loss of choice.
Yeah.
And so those things are a real issue, right? And then, of course, in order to get rid of those, we swing the pendulum back the other way. Right back over. So the natural way the polarity works is that how Barry Johnson describes it with the infinity loop, right? Yeah. Once we come down, we're going to go back up. Then if we overfocus, we're going to end up. And what Brian and I have kind of added to that is, well, what would it be like if we could loosen our grip on that pole that we really love and step more towards the center and reintegrate these two things and hold them together? So when you think about that, like in this pandemic, if we were to be able to hold our individual freedom with as equal importance as the collective responsibility that we all have for the whole, what would the mindset be that you would have? How would you operate?
Yeah. So a word that we use often, it's actually a biblical word, is other-mindedness. There may be others that are just as good, but that's the first one that came to my mind.
Yeah. And other-mindedness, define that for like, what does that mean?
So it's the active choice to put the needs of others equal to or greater than my own. Freedom from having been coerced to do so, but the active choice to do it. And I don't know, maybe self-sacrifice is another word that's similar. I'm interested to hear what you would put on this. This is the part, by the way, of the whole process that really fascinates me, because you can engage people in trying to imagine something that our language almost isn't adequate for, as you mentioned in the book. And so you almost have to you have to be willing to sort of free your mind and just come up with new words. I think you talk about like helping people come up with not nonsense words, but words that aren't really words, but they work for that group to describe how they want to show up in the world.
Yes, absolutely. And it oftentimes is a discovery process. So we talk about this a bit in the book too, but the exercise we just went through, it's really quick, right? And it's our heads, and it's from our heads, and intellectually we can understand what the overuses, the benefits and overuses are. These next two pieces are really where you bring the heart in. Parker Palmer says this so well. He's like, the mind can never resolve a paradox. It can only be resolved by the heart. And so to be able to stand in this place of the blend, it's really that versus melts away, right? And these two can stand together. So it's often a place of discovery. And the first couple of times you ask yourself the question, there may be nothing there. And it's more about like, oh, if I just went out in the world today and experimented with showing up like I was holding both of these things in each hand, and then I like braided them together, how might I show up in the world? One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about of what the third way is for this, and I was having a conversation with a colleague who's in Alaska earlier this week, and a lot of times here we'll use metaphors, or we'll use metaphors are often useful. And he brought up the mask that as an object right now, right? We see everyone wearing masks. And he said, you know what I found? And he's in Alaska, and he's got his ancestors are from Vietnam and from Alaska, actually from Italy and Vietnam, and he lives in Alaska. And he said, what I know about the Asian culture is the mask for them has always represented, they wear that to protect the other, right? To be more focused on the other. He said, what I'm noticing about in the United States is we've been wearing it to protect ourselves.
100%. 100%.
And so, it talks about the preferences there. And I was like, oh, what if then, and this is what he and I were talking about, was like, what if that mask could be a symbol for the third way, which is I wear the mask to protect you and to protect me. Right. So you said other-mindedness. It's like,
Yeah.
I make this choice to make sure that your interests are of equal interest of mine, not more than and not less than. It's of equal interest. And so the mask, that's what I've been using the most. It's like,
that's so good.
If I were to put my mask on right now to protect you and to protect me, how might I show up in the world?
Yeah.
And that's a great example of the third way. And then if we looked at what's at risk to people to do that, right? Where might there be uncertainty? Where might there be risk? Where might there be fear? I can think of a whole bunch of them for myself, just around, wow, I am scared of getting sick, right? I'm scared of my neighbors getting sick.
Well, or even just more shallow things like I just don't want to have to put something on my face. Like, I don't want to have this social obligation that if I'm going to go get on a train that I should be wearing a mask. I just kind of want to do what I want.
Yeah.
Which is very American, unfortunately.
Well, and that's the thing. It doesn't need to be judged, right? There's nothing about any. It just is. So when we can use a tool like the Navigator and be able to take something that's subject and make it object, it allows the judgment just to go away and be able to be with it with more compassion and understanding of our humanity is our humanity. We all have, we've all got fears. That's why courage is what it is,
Yeah.
And so to say for some people, it might be the vanity, right? It might be like, I'm afraid to have to put something on that's going to make me look ugly or silly, or I'm going to be embarrassed. For other people, it might be a deeper fear of being sick, or for better yet, some people, it might be, I'm going to be in complete isolation. And if I have to be in isolation and alone with myself, like I can't imagine anything worse. Right. And that's the beauty of it. It can be to whatever level it is. And that's just the thing we have to pay attention to, because it's the risk of that will keep us from placing that mask on for the good of self and other. And so we're like, is that worth it? Is the fear of that really worth it? And can I find the courage to stand in that place, that allows me to blend them together and to do both?
And so to finish it out, I think the next step would be strategies for actually integrating. The mask actually serves as like image and also strategy, I think. But obviously not right now because there's such a shortage, but like assuming we get to a point where we've got enough, I think of the fact that we're having this very meaningful conversation over Zoom right now, which to me feels like a strategy in and of itself for like, we can do our part to practice social distancing while also, or maybe physical distancing while not necessarily having to practice social distancing, because we can connect through technology, which feels to me like another strategy.
Yeah. Yes, I completely agree. And as you can see, a strategy, just for us having the conversation in and of itself raises your awareness and understanding of the dynamic that then allows us to go back into the world with a bit more awareness to go, oh, how do I want to act today that allows me to do both, right? Like there was a great example in the Atlantic today. There was an article about knowing your role, and that right now there's basically two roles. There are the people that are, caring for people, and the people that are keeping the supply chain open to keep us all fed and nourished. And then there's everybody else.
Yep.
And everybody else's role is to ensure that we give the people in group A as much time as they can, as they need.
I actually, on my monitor right here, I have that article. So if anyone listening or watching, you haven't read it, it's called How the Pandemic Will End by Ed Yong, Y-O-N-G. It's in the Atlantic. And they have opened it up beyond their, I think beyond their typical paywall, as they have done with a lot of their coronavirus stuff. It is an excellent article. And I agree that part struck me as pretty powerful too. Like there's group A and there's group B. And if you're part of group B, your job is to try and buy time for group A. Kelly, as we begin to draw the conversation to a close, Any other thoughts or highlights around navigating? Oh, and I did want to make sure, don't you guys have a downloadable form of your worksheet on your website?
We do. If you go to navigatingpolarities.com, you can find the link to Amazon for the book. And you also can, if you just pop your email address in there, there's a downloadable and also like an editable navigator that you can utilize to work, any of the polarities that you might be in the midst of.
So navigatingpolarities.com, and they can sign up to hear from you. Yeah.
Yep.
And I'm assuming you guys have a newsletter that goes out, things like that. Great.
Yep.
So yeah, any closing thoughts, Kelly, and or reflections on anything that we've talked about or that you didn't get to mention as it pertains to how we navigate these polarities? I've really enjoyed this conversation. So yeah, any closing thoughts on your part?
Oh, that feels like such a big question, boy. Golly. I'll say this, like times like this are uncertain, unsettling, complex, hard, scary. And I personally have found this lens, right? Polarities is a lens of many lenses. And I have found it to be a very useful lens to be able to navigate, some of the things that looking back now look like they were minuscule, and some of the harder things like the paradox of life and death, as my mom was kind of sick with ALS and taking her last, walks through life. And it allowed me to do it with as much joy as there was sadness. And I just think times like these, we can get so mired in the dark, because there is a lot of dark that's happening right now. And, polarities aren't new. Like light dark has been around since the beginning of time. And that's what this fundamentally helps us be in the midst of, is to find the light in the midst of dark, and to appreciate that even in the midst of light, there's also dark. So I just highly encourage people to seek out ways that will support them in showing up as their best and supporting others while they're doing it. So.
Thank you so much for that. So the book, again, is called Navigating Polarities, Using Both and Thinking to Lead Transformation. And my understanding is this is going to be the first in a series where you're going to apply polarity navigation to a lot of different things, which is very exciting.
That's true.
Is there another one slated to come out at a specific time?
Yep. There's one right now that's being finished up that's about navigating polarities in teams.
Okay.
So it'll be particular to teams. And I am kind of working out the outline for navigating polarities in coaching.
Excellent.
To be able to help people really apply this deeply in their coaching work.
That is great. So Navigating Polarities by Emerson and Lewis, and go to navigatingpolarities.com if you want to get that editable Polarity Navigator and get their newsletter. It's just such a helpful tool. So Kelly, thank you so much for spending this time talking with me. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me. It was a pleasure.
So what can you do with polarity management? I think if you and I can navigate polarities more effectively, not only will we work more like a human, we can help others to do the same. There's a couple of ideas and applications as we bring this episode to a close. First, think about your own leadership style, your own work-life harmony. What are some polarities that you have to navigate on a daily basis? Can you name them? Can you create your own polarity navigator and walk through them? Next, is there anyone in your life that you think might be approaching a polarity as if it were a problem to be solved? And you can give them the gift of self-awareness to help them recognize, hey, you're approaching this as if it needs to be solved, when in fact it requires both and thinking. In my experience, that can be a huge weight off people's shoulders. I've seen this happen in classrooms, and I've seen it happen in one-to-one coaching conversations. Think about how your polarity management, using this Polarity Navigator, you can help enrich the systems and the teams and the cultures that you are a part of. This is one way that I think you can work more like a human. Thank you so much for having listened to this episode. I really look forward to talking with you again next time about what it means to work like a human. Be well. Go Innovation helps people be more human in life and work. We are executive coaches, facilitators, and organizational development consultants, and we would love to support you. To learn more, go to go-innovation.com or send an email to hello@go-innovation.com.